Well, thanks so much, Samaya, for that warm and generous introduction. Thanks to the Center for having me out, and to all of you for coming on a bright, sunny, warm day when you could be playing Frisbee. I appreciate it. Yes, I'm going to talk about the current events in Iraq, and as usual with me, my charge is to contextualize them and to give some historical background because I admire our journalists tremendously, and they get the story and they risk their lives, but they're not left a lot of time by their editors to read long books about history. And that's my charge. And I will say that I won't talk about my new book, The New Arabs, How the Millennial Generation is Changing the Middle East so much today. It won't be so much generationally focused, but I do urge you to keep in mind that the social dislocations on a vast scale and the kind of extremist politics that has emerged in Syria and Iraq is not typical of the 400 million or so people who live in the Middle East. There's lots of other things going on, and if anything, a kind of secular-minded nationalism is a little bit out of control in Egypt right now, where even mild Muslim parties are being accused of terrorism and so forth. So in a way, Egypt and Iraq are mirror images of one another at the moment, and I just do want to underline that we shouldn't take these events in Syria and Iraq as a proxy for the whole region. They're actually quite remarkable and peculiar in the sense of being quite different from the rest of the region. And I talk in my book about the relatively successful transition away from authoritarianism and towards a much more open and compromising kind of politics in Tunisia, which, because it's Francophone and so forth, the American journalistic and academic establishments tend not to focus very much on, but I think it's been often a bellwether and a thought leader for the region, and people don't pay enough attention to Tunisia, and there something quite promising is happening. But my charge today here is to take you into much more depressing terrain. And I'm going to talk about Iraq primarily, with some reference to Syria. This map has caused a lot of trouble. And it's only, as with all maps, it's only partially true, and it leaves out as much as it shows. But the point of the map is that Iraq is a multicultural society, and that it is characterized by three large communities, and there are lots of smaller ones, by the way. The Shiite Arabic speakers of the south, the dark green, the Sunni Arabs of the center north, the white part, and then the Kurds in the far north, which is showing to you, it should be brown, but it's kind of grayish up there. And these ethnic and religious identities have been important in modern Iraqi history. Iraq was a set of provinces of the Ottoman Empire, ruled from Istanbul in the 19th century and before, but in the course of World War I, the British Indian Army invaded Basra, and modern Iraq is really what the British Indian Army could conquer in the course of the war from 1916 to 1918. That's how far you can march up from Basra and defeat the Ottoman army. And so, unlike some other states which were formed with a core ruling group that gradually expanded and maybe especially expanded in a particular linguistic region, you think about France, where the Bourbons gradually expanded their rule over time, and you get a modern nation state forming. Iraq, as with many countries of the global south, is a colonial production. And it throws together people who, if you were to reason back from nationalistic concerns, don't necessarily have a lot in common. The Kurdish speakers of the north speak an Indo-European language, ultimately, by the way, related to English, whereas the Arabic speakers speak a Semitic language. And in pre-modern times, these things didn't matter quite so much because identity was imperial identity, so they were all Ottoman subjects and loyal to the Sultan, and the Kurds and the Sunni Arabs were all Sunni Muslims together and so forth. But modern European romantic nationalism makes a big deal out of linguistic and religious identity. The other thing to say about this map, and why I started by saying that it's misleading or inaccurate, is that for much of the period since modern Iraq was formed as an independent nation in 1932, these divisions haven't necessarily been the key ones. In the 50s, there were very strong socialist movements, communist and Ba'athist, that deliberately worked against ethnic identity as a keynote. And so the Communist Party mixed together Shiite Muslims, and at that time in the 50s, Iraq still had some 10,000 Jews, and some proportion of the Jews joined the Communist Party. And the Ba'ath Party, which was developed during World War II by medical graduate students at the American University in Beirut, who in my view had way too much time on their hands, and the professors should have given them more homework. But they came up with this idea of a kind of pan-Arab identity that was secular, since these two were Christians. And so one could be a member of the Ba'ath Party and be Muslim or Christian or Jewish or Sunni or Shiite. It didn't matter so much. And so attempts were made to create forms of political identity that elided these kinds of primordial identities, and often quite successfully, not to mention the whole project of modern Iraqi and modern Arab nationalism. Modern Iraqi nationalism maybe had more promise. Modern Arab nationalism had the difficulty that it didn't attract the interest of the Kurds, who are not Arabs. Arab is not an ethnic category, actually. It's a linguistic one, but obviously excludes non-native speakers of Arabic. The Ba'ath Party, unfortunately, did tend to racialize Arabness, and I think hoped to get the Kurds all to speak Arabic and so become Arabs. And those of you who have studied Arabic and have encountered the hollow verb know why the Kurds resisted this tendency. With regard particularly to the Sunni Arabs of northern and western Iraq, it is often said that they have been the elite of Iraq for 400 years under the Ottoman rule. The Ottoman Empire was, I think, self-consciously a Sunni Arab empire and opposed itself to the Shiite Safavids in Iran after 1501. But the wrinkle here is that we historians don't think that there were many Iraqi Shiites during the Ottoman period until about the 19th century. That is to say, people in southern Iraq, the Marsh Arabs and the tribes, the Muntafik Confederation and so forth of the tribes of the south, probably were Sunni until the late 18th and early 19th century, and only over time, through the 19th century, did you even have a lot of Shiite Iraqis, much less that they ultimately became the majority. And it would take me too far afield to tell you how all this happened, but it was in part Indian influence, because the Indian Nawabs that I studied in my dissertation sent money to build canals, and the tribes settled to irrigate off the canals and then were missionized by the Shiite clergy who had this extra income from the Indian Shiites. So Iraq, you know, in many ways, economically and culturally, is ambidextrous in the sense that it's under both Middle Eastern and Indian, South Asian influences. In fact, to this day, there are 4 grand ayatollahs in Najaf. The leading one is Iranian, Ayatollah Sistani. 2 of them are not Iraqi also. One is from Karachi in Pakistan, and the other is Afghan. So it just tells you something about Iraqi Shiism, that its chief leadership is so multicultural. And Afghanistan and India and Pakistan, of course, are South Asian. So, however, it is the case that as the South went Shiite in the 19th and early 20th century, once the British conquered Iraq, they marginalized those Shiite tribes of the South, who gave them a lot of trouble, the Shiites of the South. The British were hoping during World War I that the Shiites would rally to the British side since they hated the Sunnis so much. But it turns out that the Shiite tribes of the South weren't really very eager to be ruled by Christians from Europe, and had kind of gotten used to the Ottoman Empire and saw it as legitimate. And so they didn't, in fact, defect in the way that the British expected. Once the British conquered the place, of course, they could always get people to sign on as constituents, but it wasn't before the fact. But the British brought with them, once, especially in 1920, the Iraqis revolted against British rule. They had been hoping, some of them, if the Ottoman Empire was going to fall, as it did, that then Iraq would be an independent country. And that didn't happen. The British decided to make it a colony. In the League of Nations era, it wasn't polite to say colony anymore, so they called it a mandate. The idea is a mandate is a colony with an expiration date. It's not like British are going to be there forever. And then a mandate is also a colony where the rulers have some responsibilities, like you can't just use slave labor and kill people at will and take away all their resources. You at least have to teach them to read and write. So the British had a mandate in Iraq, and the Iraqis were very disappointed with this decision, and many of them rebelled, especially the Shiites. The British put that down, and they had a problem, is that they during World War I, the British double booked Syria. You know how the airlines sometimes will sell you a seat on an airplane, and then they'll also sell it to somebody else, and you get there and someone's in your seat, and then they want to give you $200 to take another flight and so forth. It's called double booking. So the British during World War I promised Syria to the French. At the same time, they promised it to the Emir of Mecca, Sharif Hussein. And once the war was over, it was inevitable that the French and the Meccans were going to have a fight over who actually got Syria. The French had better guns, and so the Meccans had taken Damascus, and Sharif Hussein's son Faisal really became the ruler in Syria for a couple years. But then the French said, no, we were promised Syria. So they went in 1920. And they kicked Faisal back out. So the British, felt badly about their perfidy. So and they had this country, Iraq, which seemed out of control and needed to have some kind of, Arab ruler because they weren't accepting the British. So they put Faisal in Iraq. Well, he was from Mecca. He never had anything to do with Iraq, but he formed a court, and he drew upon the ex-Ottoman Sunnis, especially for his court elite. So modern Iraq going forward was formed by the British in a way that privileged the Sunnis. So the officer corps of 20th century Iraq initially was all Ottoman trained and very disproportionately, if not completely, Sunni. And so the Shia were excluded by the Faisal monarchy from a lot of political power. And the British also put in property laws that encouraged, without I think their meaning to, large landlordism and a kind of hacienda system of the sort that you saw in Central America as well. These enormous estates were built up by these landlords. So by 1958, 2,000 or 3,000 families owned the lion's share of the good land in Iraq, and there were millions of landless peasants who had lost their property in this process. And so in 58 there was a revolution against that British installed monarchy. People seem to have been really disaffected with it. They grabbed the pro-British prime minister and dragged him through the streets and killed him and then buried him. And then the next day they came back and disinterred him and dragged him through the streets more. So they were upset. And the colonels, the Iraqi officer corps made a coup. That wasn't a big change because the officer corps was largely Sunni at that point. But so the Sunni Arabs continued to be disproportionately represented high in the administration, but the old British installed monarchy was overthrown. Then the Ba'ath Party took over permanently, or for 30 years in 1968. The Ba'athis, as I mentioned, were Arab nationalists. They believed that all the Arabs should be in one state, kind of have a United States of Arabia, and that it should be a socialist state. It should form the new Arab man, is what they called it, or the new Arab human being. They were all about development and education and industrialization and urbanization. They were a kind of high modernist, Stalinist kind of party. One-party state. If you criticized the government, the black limousines came for you in the middle of the night and you weren't heard from again. It was very brutal. Ultimately in 1979, Saddam Hussein emerged as the leader of the Ba'ath Party. He held a party congress, and he was kind of a paranoid person and had sniffed out who might go along with his coup and who might not. And so he would give red cards and green cards to people. Red card, very bad. So he gave red cards to about a third of the party congress, and they were taken out, and we don't know what happened to them. Or we have a pretty good idea what happened to them. They don't have marked graves. By the way, when the Shiites executed Saddam in 2006, they gave him a red card first. But Saddam, in the 80s and 90s, because of the Iran-Iraq War and then the sanctions, the Gulf War and the sanctions the U.S. put on Iraq, needed constituencies. He didn't have as much oil money to buy people off, and he needed to do politics. One of the things that he did in the 90s was to try to revive tribal allegiances. It was a kind of state-led retribalization of Iraq. And of course, he especially reached out to the Sunni Arab tribes. So his own Abu Nasser was a power base. These are from his hometown of Tikrit. In Salahuddin, you had the Jabur tribe. Al-Anbar is dominated by the Dulaim. And some of these are very large, like the Dulaim. Almost everybody in Anbar is Dulaim, so it's not really tribal in the sense of a tribe of a republic of cousins, because even very distant relations are still Dulaim. And you had Shamar northwest of Baghdad and Tai and Mosul and so forth. So these were important tribal units that Saddam in the 90s especially began trying to reinvigorate. And you can see in this map a little bit about where the tribes were. I have to warn you that the American generals who invaded Iraq in 2003 didn't know who these tribes were or where they predominated. They admitted this. I don't think they did their homework. I don't think they read all those books and articles we had been writing about Iraq. Of course, we didn't write them to help them invade it. But you know, if you were going to invade and rule a country, wouldn't you read a book about it? And the ignorance of the Americans in Iraq is just breathtaking. You know, one of the great Kurdish freedom fighters was Mustafa al-Barzani, or Mustafa Barzani. And he had this handlebar mustache, and he liked the gun belt around the shoulder, and you know, he would pose. So Paul Bremer, who was appointed by Bush to be the viceroy of Iraq in 2003-04, whose major diplomatic mission had been to Holland, was brought in to run Iraq. And he went up at one point to meet with the Kurds and to see the Kurdistan parliament. There was this picture on the wall of this handsome revolutionary, and he said, "That's a striking figure. Who is that?" It was Mustafa Barzani. This would be as though the United States invaded Cuba and sent someone out there to run it. And he said, "Well, who's that man with the beard and the cigar?" So they didn't know about the Sunni tribes. Sunni Arabs in Iraq were mainly, I think, attracted in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even after by Arab nationalism. And this was a divide in Iraq because the Shiite Iraqis and the Kurdish Iraqis not so interested in the wider Arab world. They didn't think they were akin to Egyptians or wanted to be in the same state with the Egyptians. Whereas in 1965, there was a very serious plan put forward in Baghdad to just join up with Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and Baghdad and Cairo would be two provincial provinces of a greater Arab state. And of course, the Syrians actually did this for 3 years. And that was a Sunni Arab project, that Arab nationalist project. The Shiites and the Kurds, well, the Shiites were more interested in Iraqi nationalism. The Sunni Arabs, despite being Arab nationalists, were also Iraqi nationalists in a way, and they benefited disproportionately from the Ba'ath Party rule. The Ba'ath that made the coup in 1968 was the civilian wing of the Ba'ath Party, and it had tended to be dominated by Sunni Arab intellectuals. The military wing of the Ba'ath actually had many more Shiites in it, but it made an aborted coup in 1963. It was only in power for about 8 months, and it was overthrown. They weren't very good at coup making. Then the Shiite officers were massacred. They were hunted down and killed and so forth. So the coup of 68 was mainly spearheaded by Sunni Arab civilian Ba'athis. And this is obscured in later, in our later images of the Ba'ath in the 68 and after are military images, but they're false. They were all mostly civilians. And Saddam Hussein, for instance, I don't think he was ever in the army. He was a failed law student. He went to Cairo University and to do a law degree, and they never finished. I think they brought him back in '63 after the first coup to pull fingernails out of people and apply electricity to sensitive parts of the bodies of communists and liberals and so forth. So, so the Sunni Arabs disproportionately benefited from Ba'ath rule, although to be fair, the Ba'ath also did include other people. So about half of the middle and lower level functionaries of the Ba'ath Party in the 80s in Iraq were Shiites. And if you think about it, I mean, it ran the whole country. So you've got to have Ba'athis in Basra and Hilla and these Shiite cities. So there's going to be Shiites who sign up to be part of the elite. And the Ba'ath Party actively discriminated against religious Shiites. But if you were a secular-minded Shiite, then you could be accepted. But as you rose higher and higher in the Ba'ath hierarchy, both in the military and the Revolutionary Command Council, you saw more and more Sunni Arab faces. And since Sunnis, the social statistics are very controversial, and people always shout at me whenever I bring them up. But I don't think the Sunni Arabs of Iraq can be more than about 17 or 18% of the population. They might be a higher percentage now that they chased all the Christians out. But remember, there are other things in Iraq, like Yazidis, or there used to be, and Christians and so forth. And the Kurds, the election results seem to suggest that they're as high as 22%, which is higher than people used to think. So I don't think the Sunni Arabs were more than about 17 or 18% of the population. And, however, they were a good, 70% of the very high officers of state. Well, the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. Despite living in a democracy and supposedly valuing transparency, I don't think any of us has the slightest idea of why in the world we did that. And I'm hoping that they haven't destroyed all the documentation on the decision making so that our successors 30 or 40 years from now will be able to see the documents and finally figure it out. But why ever they did it, once they went in, they did it in alliance with Iraqi expatriate dissidents, who were largely Shiite and Kurdish, and all kinds of Shiites, pro-Iran Shiites, fundamentalist Shiites, secular-minded Shiites, ex-Ba'athi Shiites, but nevertheless largely Shiites and Kurds. And Paul Bremer, who was the viceroy, the American administration of Iraq never had any legal framework. There was no congressional act establishing the Coalition Provisional Authority, the CPA. The people in Iraq called it can't provide anything, CPA. So Paul Bremer's appointment to run Iraq was done by fiat. The Bush administration just said he was the viceroy of Iraq. And he, in a recent interview, has admitted that he got enormous pressure from both the Kurds and the Shiites of Iraq to dissolve the Iraqi army, which he did. The Iraqi Army Officer Corps was disproportionately Sunni Arab, and being an officer was one of the sources of their prestige and power. So those guys are now unemployed. They went from being generals to being unemployed. And then the Shiites who came to power on the backs of the Americans announced that they were going to do what was called de-Baathification. And apparently this was on the model of denazification. Well, that's what they said. The Ba'ath Party had been like the Nazis, and therefore anybody who had been a member of the Ba'ath Party should be fired from their government job and excluded from public life. Except if you know anything at all about the American occupation of Germany after World War II, that's not how the Nazis were treated. The Nazi high school teachers went on teaching high school, and those chancellors and high German politicians of the 50s, I mean, most of them had been members of the Nazi Party in the 30s. They were young, but they were members. So the Americans did not, in fact, treat the former Nazis of Germany the way that the Shiites wanted to treat the Baathists. But this included like firing high school teachers because they were Ba'ath Party members. And in the Saddam period in the 90s, say you were a high school teacher and you had the opportunity to go to a summer school in London about Shakespeare. The only way you could go to London would be if you had a passport. And guess who are the only people who could have a passport? Ba'ath Party members. So people might have joined the party for all kinds of reasons, but they were all punished. We think 70 to 100,000 people were fired for having been members of the Ba'ath Party, and the majority of them were Sunni Arabs. And then the Americans, have this, I have nothing against entrepreneurs. In fact, I admire them tremendously. But it's not natural. It's not something that people know how to do just because they were born. We don't have very many instincts as human beings. It's not like being afraid of falling. And the people who came to Iraq around Bremer thought that if only they destroyed the state factories, that entrepreneurs would arise and the magic hand would suddenly create all kinds of new businesses. And after all those years of socialist Ba'athist rule, no Iraqis knew how to create a business. So they destroyed the state factories and created enormous unemployment among the former workers in the state. They destroyed the pickle factory. And all the people who used to work at the pickle factory no longer had jobs canning and whatever mysteries go into making pickles. And so they were just at home without an income. And there was no private business in Iraq at this point. It was just government jobs. And guess who had been fired from all the government jobs? So enormous unemployment swept through the Sunni Arab cities of Tikrit, Fallujah, Mosul, Ramadi in the course of 2003-2004 when the Americans were directly ruling Iraq. And the message, and this was not inevitable. The Sunni Arabs of Iraq were on the fence when the Americans first came in. The ones who were diehard supporters of Saddam were very tiny. And many of them thought, well, the Americans, one journalist friend of mine did an interview with a Syrian before the war, a Syrian official, and she expressed concern about what would happen. And the Syrian official, she says, told her, they said, well, these Western powers sometimes colonize us, and it's horrible, but they usually leave at least some good things behind when they go. So, the Sunni Arabs were wondering, what good thing might the Americans leave for them? But then it gradually became apparent that no, the Americans were there specifically to screw them over, and that there was not going to be any upside to all of this. The Shiites and the Kurds were going to be the powers. The Sunni Arabs were going to be largely disenfranchised because it was a unicameral parliament where the Sunni Arabs were proportionally represented, if that, and so they were going to lose every vote from here to eternity because the Shiites and the Kurds would always overrule them. And this is what happened as politics unfolded. Well, this would be as though a foreign country, we won't name names, occupied the United States, fired all of the generals in the Pentagon, sent home the cadets at West Point, fired all the people who had graduated from the Harvard School of Business, and reached down and put minorities, let us say, in power instead. What do you think those West Point graduates would do to this foreign power? Would they take that lying down? So the Sunni Arabs, many of whom had had experience in the Iran-Iraq War or the Gulf War, began forming guerrilla groups to fight the Americans. They wanted them out of their country. And some 50 major guerrilla organizations and cells were established all throughout that white area I showed you of northern and western Iraq where the Sunni Arabs predominated. The majority of them, by the way, were secular-minded groups. So you had the Phalange of the 1920 revolution, hearkening back to the revolt against the British. Confusingly, the Army of Islam was a Marxist group. The Army of the Holy Warriors, also I think largely socialists, and so forth. So they had some of these kind of religious language in their names, but they were mostly neo-Ba'athist of some sort, and often led by former Iraqi officers or by warrant sergeants or the equivalent, many of whom had been trained in munitions and tactics and weaponry in the Iraqi army, often in accordance with the old Soviet handbooks. And you know, the Soviets had their equivalent of our Navy SEALs or Special Forces, the Spetsnaz. So this was often the background of these Iraqi guerrillas. And they started practicing those special ops tactics on the American military. And I can remember, I'm not ready for that slide. I can remember, I was watching Iraq very carefully all through this war, and sort of in May of 2003, a Jeep was blown up by an improvised explosive device. It was near Fallujah, and then another one. And I wrote in my blog, this is becoming a guerrilla war. This looks like what I saw I was in Beirut in the early years of the civil war there. And there is a official definition of guerrilla war in the U.S. military handbook, and one of the reporters quoted it to then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and said in the summer of 2003, he said, "Isn't this what's going on?" And fit it to the T. And Rumsfeld just said no. The Bush administration was a very Orwellian administration in the sense they were all about language. So when in 2006, when there was a Sunni Shiite civil war, the NBC finally decided 3,000 people were being killed a month in sectarian violence. The NBC decided that this was a civil war. And the Bush administration actually wrote them a letter of reprimand, that they were using this inappropriate terminology for what was going on in Iraq. And they would always say, well, you know, we have riots. There were riots in Cincinnati or Benton Harbor. Every country has its problems. So one of the leaders of the resistance, however, was not a neo-Ba'athist or a secularist, but from Jordan, and what was called a Salafi. In my view, Salafi Muslims tend to be those who are deeply influenced by the Wahhabi sect of Saudi Arabia, but who want to remain within the Sunni Arab, Sunni fold. And, you know, in the Gulf and so forth, people say Wahhabis and Sunnis. They don't think they're the same thing. In the United States, it's all folded in together. But there are certain principles of Wahhabism that the Sunni tradition rejects. For instance, in Wahhabism, originally at least, you weren't supposed to have a school of law, whereas in Sunnism there are 4, and you have to be one of the 4. Now the Wahhabis have gradually started adopting the Hanbali school, but in original Wahhabism, it wasn't allowed to follow a school. And then, in addition to that, the Wahhabi tradition is characterized by what's called takfir, or excommunicating other Muslims who claim to be Muslims. And the Sunni tradition frowns on this, at least within the Sunni tradition. It's a big tent tradition. So, like you would say, well, what do you do with the Sunni who drinks? Because you're not supposed to drink in Islam. So the Sunni jurist would say, well, that's a bad Sunni. We would say he's not a Sunni at all. And in fact, there are many great jurists, Suyuti and others, who say that takfir is contrary to the Sunni tradition. Whereas in Wahhabism, they excommunicated the Ottoman Sultan, who was supposedly the leader of Islam at the time. The Ottomans minded. So they sent Muhammad Ali from Egypt to defeat the Saudis, and they captured some of their rulers, brought them to Istanbul. They stuffed them into cannons and shot them out. It's a way of executing them. Now when Prime Minister Erdogan meets King Abdullah, this must be, you know, a little bit awkward. But anyway, the Zarqawi was a Salafi. And Salafism had developed in Jordan, and not all the Salafis were political. In fact, most Jordanian Salafis were quietists. They were apolitical. They felt like Islam in Jordan, you know, had become corrupt, and people weren't being proper Muslims, and they were determined in their own mosque and their own community to have this much more rigid and rigorous kind of Islam as they conceived it. But Zarqawi became what is known as the Salafi Jihadi, in the sense that he combined a belief in a particular interpretation of Sunni Islam with a belief that in vigilantism. And again, in the classical Sunni tradition of law, you can't just wake up in the morning as an individual engineering student and declare jihad on Europe. It has to be the people who bind and loose, the authorities of the community. The medieval period would have been the sultan who declared jihad. They make a distinction in Sunni law between obligations in Islam that fall upon individuals, prayer and fasting and pilgrimage and so forth, and obligations that fall upon the community as a whole. And those obligations that fall on the community as a whole are then assigned by the leaders of the community. But in the course of the 20th century, a belief in Sunni vigilantism grew up, which is contrary to this juridical tradition, which says that anybody can volunteer to declare jihad. This position has been roundly condemned, both excommunicating other Muslims, the takfir, and this idea of vigilantism was roundly condemned by a big conference in Amman in 2005, to which many Sunni muftis or jurisconsults came, as well as the leading Shia authorities were there. But Zarqawi is on the other side of things. He believes in this kind of vigilantism and takfir, excommunication. In '89, he ran off to Afghanistan from Jordan, where he didn't end up getting to fight the Soviet troops because they had just left. But he did stay around and become a troublemaker for a while. He had bad relations with bin Laden. And then he came back to Jordan and was promptly arrested and spent the 90s in prison, which didn't improve his mood. In '99, he went back to Afghanistan. He set up a camp near Herat. He competed with al-Qaeda. He again went back to Jordan and was arrested and released. And then in October of 2001, he went to Iraqi Kurdistan, where there was a small group called Ansar al-Islam of these Salafi jihadis, many of whom had fought in Afghanistan and were radicalized by that experience. The fact that Zarqawi was in Iraq was used by the Bush administration as a pretext for the invasion. They said, you see, al-Qaeda is in Iraq. Well, Zarqawi wasn't on good terms with al-Qaeda, and the fact that he was physically in Iraq, as an individual person, would not indict the whole country and make it deserving of invasion. And the high officials of the Bush administration, Dick Cheney and Colin Powell and so forth, retailed this fairy story that Zarqawi was wounded and brought to Baghdad for hospital treatment, and Saddam came to see him in hospital, and I don't know, the nurses were bringing him grapes to eat, and he was being treated all very nicely and so forth. This story, which Colin Powell and Dick Cheney and a lot of these guys told repeatedly to the press and in speeches, is made up. I mean, it's just not true. And in fact, after they conquered Iraq, the Americans got a hold of the Ba'ath documents, and they put them at this military base in Colorado, and many of them were put up on the web for a while. They're back down now. But I went through some of them, and I found the All Points Bulletin on Zarqawi from 2002. So the Ba'athi secret police were saying, this man is very dangerous. He was in Afghanistan. He might be connected to bin Laden, and he should be found. And you should shake down the Jordanians wherever they are in Iraq. If there's a Jordanian, worker colony or Jordanian smugglers or wherever they are, go to the Jordanians and find this Zarqawi and arrest him. He's very dangerous. That's what the Ba'ath government's real attitude towards this guy was. But after the American invasion, Zarqawi began reaching out to the Iraqi Sunnis beyond Ansar al-Islam, and had some success in attracting converts to his cause, who then started attacking the United States. And they used, some of them had been in Afghanistan, they used what they learned there, and he even recruited Iraqis to go blow up hotels in Jordan in 2005. Again, you know, they arrested one of these, was a woman, and the Jordanian police asked her, why are you doing these things? She said the infidels and apostates from among the Muslims needed to be fought. So they were killing other Sunni Muslims because they didn't think that they were proper Sunni Muslims. And if that's what they thought of the Sunnis, imagine what they thought of the Shiites. There's a letter attributed to Zarqawi in which he expressed his horror of Iraq. Being from a small Sunni city, Zarqa in Jordan, when he gets to Iraq, what does he find? Yazidis, Twelver Shiites, Shabak, all kinds of heresies of the most extreme sorts from his point of view. This letter is like, you know, a horror movie from a fundamentalist Sunni point of view. And of course, he thinks these people need to be destroyed. So the Jordanian secret police probably helped the Americans to track him down and kill him in 2006. And the Americans at the time, the generals, were blaming everything on Zarqawi. Some of you don't remember these days, but I remember General Rick Lynch came out and said 80% of the attacks in Iraq were being fomented by Zarqawi's group, which at some point he made up with bin Laden and declared that he was al-Qaeda in the Mesopotamia. I mean, I just thought that this is ridiculous because Zarqawi and his group, you know, they could only be so many places. So, you know, it's like hundreds of miles from Mosul to Baghdad. What did they blow something up in Mosul and jump in the car and get down to West Baghdad? I mean, 80% of attacks from one group, how does that make any sense? And of course, when Zarqawi was killed, the attacks just went on, so there wasn't any difference. And once he was dead, he was succeeded by a shadowy figure, Abu Omar al-Baghdadi, which of course is a nom de plume, for a few years. And they renamed the organization the Islamic State in Iraq, which is very clever. If you had a small group of cultists in the United States who were from the Patriot movement and they thought they're the real United States, and they called themselves the United States, they would force the journalists who reported on them to refer to them that way, right? So if they blew something up, you would have to say the United States blew something up. Well, this is the same tactic that the Baghdadi used in calling it the Islamic State. They specialized in terror. They were particularly brutal in their terrorism. They practiced this on Sunnis. If a Sunni signed up to join the Iraqi police, they would blow the Sunni cadets up. They really went after the Shiites because they wanted to polarize Iraq between Sunnis and Shiites and make the Shiites hate the Sunnis, have the Shiites attack the Sunnis, and then the Sunnis would have no recourse but to come to them to organize them to defend the community. So they would go and blow up a Shiite wedding, and then, you know, in Islam you have the funeral the same day, that evening. They don't believe in embalming. So they would come back and they would know to blow up the funeral. They would blow up children in ice cream shops. They blew up a pet shop at one point. Poor little snakes were, wriggling half dead. They just were mad bombers. They would also snipe. They sniped at people. And they probably were behind the 2006 Civil War. They developed cells and safe houses in several provinces, Diyala, Salahuddin, Al-Anbar, and Nineveh, especially in the Sunni Arab provinces. And they were helped, I think, by the Shiite political establishment that came to power in elections in 2005, and the Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, who came to power in 2006. Al-Maliki was an old-time Shiite revolutionary who had tried to overthrow Saddam. He was from the Dawah party, which wanted to see a Shiite state of Iraq. And these were the guys who got into power. One of his allies was the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, a Shiite party that was formed by Ayatollah Khomeini when the Shiite Iraqis were in exile in Tehran, and which had a paramilitary, the Badr Corps, of fighters who were trained by the Iranian and paid by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. So this is the new elite of Iraq. It's the Dawah party, the Shiite Islamic party. It's the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, and the Sunnis are marginalized, neglected, accused of being terrorists, and the government, the Americans, and then this Iraqi government, if there was a bombing someplace, they would just go in and arrest everybody, all the young men in the region. So they came to have like 50,000 guys in jail, 2/3 of whom at least were Sunnis, and many of them, wrongly imprisoned and for years with no judicial process, and to this day. And then I'm finishing up now. In 2011, when the Arab Spring came along and there were civilian protests all around the Arab world, there were also protests in Syria and Iraq. And in Syria, unfortunately, the regime decided to deal with the protests by killing the protesters, which encouraged the protesters then to militarize, pick up arms, and the Syrian revolution becomes instead a civil war. And these guys, the Islamic State of Iraq, who now have as their head Ibrahim as-Samarrai, he came to power in 2010 after his predecessor was killed. They run off to Aleppo in northern Syria and become among the very best and most successful guerrilla fighters in the Syrian civil war. A lot of people think that Bashar al-Assad and his regime avoided fighting them and kind of cultivated them because they wanted their opposition to be seen as al-Qaeda. I mean, there are so many liberals and mainstream Sunnis among the rebels, but the regime would fight them, the Free Syrian Army guys and so forth, the liberals, but it would leave the Islamic State people alone because they wanted them to gain territory and gain traction to become the face of the revolution, so that then the world community would side with the Damascus regime. And it is true. Until this summer, for the previous 18 months, there were no major battles between the Syrian army and the so-called Islamic State, even as it was taking territory. And they also pioneered in raiding Ba'ath army depots for weaponry. So there's a problem with the rebels in Syria not getting medium and heavy weaponry from the outside, but they just grabbed the regime's medium and heavy weaponry. So they start to have tanks and so forth. In Iraq, the major sort of Arab Spring effect was among the Sunni Arabs, and in Fallujah and in Abeji and several cities, there were youth demonstrations of the sort that happened in Tunisia and Egypt, and about which I talked in my book. But the al-Maliki government did exactly what the Bashar al-Assad government did. It was that they deployed helicopter gunships against these civilian youth demonstrations and put them down very brutally. And I think in so doing doomed themselves, because they took the hope out of the youth in the Sunni Arab regions that there could be any peaceful change. So in June, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant comes back over into Iraq from its bases in Syria and makes an alliance with those neo-Ba'athist guerrilla groups that I showed you before, who are still active, and says, let's overthrow the Maliki government in the Sunni Arab cities. And so it foments a series of urban uprisings. It wasn't that like 5,000 sort of fighters came into Mosul and took over a city of 2 million. That's preposterous. They coordinated with the city quarter leaders to have big demonstrations, and the people of Mosul came out and threw stones at the Iraqi army. If you've got 2 million people throwing stones at you, even if you're tens of thousands of troops, you will run away. And especially, most of the troops by this time are Shiites, so they're in alien territory. Their officers are corrupt. They don't trust them. And so they just ran away to Baghdad. And they left behind their tanks and their armored vehicles and their artillery pieces for ISIL to capture. And then this was done in Tikrit and other cities as well. And they even started marching on Erbil in Kurdistan, at which point President Obama felt that he couldn't let Kurdistan fall to ISIL. These guys are very brutal, and they already were starting a genocide against the Yazidi sect, and so he intervened with Air Force to protect Erbil and to push the Islamic State fighters back from the Mosul dam, which is also a very strategic facility. So my argument in this talk has been that American policies and the policies of their Shiite and Kurdish allies on the political side in Iraq were responsible in some large part for allowing al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia and then the various Islamic State groups to succeed in a political appeal to the Sunni Arabs of Iraq, who wouldn't have accepted that appeal in 2002. These were Baathists, they were socialists, they were relatively secular-minded people on the whole. But by 2014, if somebody came to them and said, we'll save you from Shiite dominance, from humiliation, from unemployment, from dissolved factories, from all of the mess that the Americans left behind and left you completely marginalized, but we're the devil, the Mosulis would sign on the dotted line in blood to make the pact with the devil. And I will leave it there and open for questions.